Okay, so I'm very excited to be with Miljački and Deane Simpson, who in my list of non-boring people are right at the top. And let's see what we can come up with. I thought of both of you when sort of getting into this question of television and architecture and so on, because it's so big and so complex, and it has this like long history and a history of architects' kind of weird relationship with television. And both of you have tuned into that history at different points in your work. And now we find ourselves in a world that might be post-TV or all TV, or, you know, that's the sort of general question of that book, right? Is to try to understand, are we kind of deeply immersed in the world of TV, so we better figure out what that history is, or have we moved beyond it? Again, we better figure out what happened. So maybe, I know I throw it back to you, because is this true? Your dissertation, really, I mean, TV was right. I mean, I'm interested in, for example, which architects, if you remove TV, the work has gone. Also, which theorists? I think if I remove TV from your PhD, it disappears, because the architects that you're looking at and their political project somehow was wrapped up in this world of TV. Is this a romantic fantasy of mine because I love TV so much?
Perhaps, but you know, they too are avatars, just like Watchman, and we can project things on them. But I do think there are parts of my book and dissertation that would fall away. The important thing that I was thinking about as I was reading your book was the kind of unevenness, of course, that the Cold War produces with this TV, the quintessential Cold War medium. And Watchman seems to be doing and thinking about doing stuff with TV and thinking about TV, the world as TV, in the 50s and even before 50s, right, in 1940s. What's interesting to think about, maybe as a preamble a little bit to the Czechs, is the fact that by 1950, TV is completely integrated in the US domestic landscape. Right. But in the Czech context and in the Eastern European context, this is far from their reality. It's only a figment of a kind of imagination of maybe architects, but in general. So in that context, the first public broadcasting station is installed in Czechoslovakia, specifically in 1954. So when they, some of them arrived to Expo 58, which is the expo in which, you know, you can see it as a face down between color TVs on the US side, between the two superpowers, right? Two big pavilions. In one, you see color TVs. In the other, you see a big statue of Lenin and Sputnik. And so those two are sort of confronted in the context of Expo 58. The Czechs are really only kind of imagining what a TV world might be like. So there is an installation of antenna by the set designer Josef Sloboda that's interesting, that maybe speaks to a kind of Czech, you know, version of surrealism in the pre-war avant-garde, but it is not a reality in any way in that context. And there's also play with images and multimedia kind of explanations or storytelling, but those are still slide projectors in that context. And so there is a kind of prefiguring, and a kind of specter of TV has reached the Eastern European context, but not the reality of owning a TV and being able to tune into it. And then the fact that there is, you know, one station in that context for 20 years and another one appears in 74 is also relevant as a comparison. So for me, some of this sort of reality of the Cold War divide is an interesting check on the universalisms that Watchman is putting forward.
Yeah. Is it possible, by the way, I mean, I was thinking when you were saying that they didn't have the actual TV, so they only had the fantasies, but sometimes the fantasy of TV might be more like TV than the reality. Like the Americans could have a sort of version of what TV could be. And the Czech fantasy might be actually more like TV. And so at the beginning, you start with kind of statues of Lenin, like stone, one figure fixed, versus American, you know, advertisements for lawnmowers or whatever in color. But actually the Czechs, frustrated not to have this thing, TV, maybe imagine it like even better or even clearer, because the American TV might also hide what TV is. Like the Americans might be a bit nervous about or the American citizen might be nervous about the extent to which TV might be an instrument of control, right? Whereas on the Czech side, maybe it could be sort of terrific to have
I think that
instrument of control.
I mean, I think TV in the Eastern European context, while it's a figment, is an exciting figment. It might be capable of unraveling something, right? It's something that's available to the population to wish for and imagine with your version of Watchmen, a kind of connected, collective world. Whereas when it actually appears, it becomes very much a very singular kind of piece, right? It goes into a kind of Big Brother world very quickly.
Right. So, I mean, I'm hearing you, I think, oh yeah, maybe thinking about TV could more dramatically affect your life than having one, right? Like, or, you know, like in life in general, if we can say that, like that which you don't have may be more in control of your imagination and your activity. So actually TV was, let's say, fully present in the fact that no one had it. And the thing that you didn't have, like everything we haven't had, like somebody else's meal always seems to be nicer, right? So not having it, so it's possible. And I was thinking, because Deane, you have done incredible work on kind of Cold War space program culture between the US and Soviet and so on. And again, that seems to be a little bit of a reversal in the sense that, you know, Sputnik is up first, right? So actually, in a certain sense, the Americans are pissed off at the Russian reality, and so the Americans have to sort of fantasize
in color,
and sort of outfox them. And similar to Anna, I know I'm forcing, but not too much, right? The connection. There is this sense in which you, Deane, you did this amazing research even on the design of the spacesuits and the kind of ideology of the clothing that would be worn by the kind of ideal sort of super socialist astronaut, or the idea that to be fully socialist would be to be an astronaut, like to be in some sort of global or trans-global sort of unified sort of technologically assisted environment. Does this ring roughly true?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I guess I was interested in this idea of this kind of new Soviet person, whether it was the sort of spaceman or spacewoman, as a kind of new kind of subject, which for me was interesting less as a sort of subject that is sent into space and more as a subject that operates in kind of on the Earth, and how that kind of translates also into the production of that subject and its presentation through different forms of media. So absolutely, and of course television and film played a really important role. Also radio in the period in kind of constructing that image of the ideal subject, and both in terms of course in the earlier period with Gagarin, but also with Tereshkova and the kind of presentation of this kind of idealized space family where she was supposedly strongly encouraged to marry another cosmonaut, and they would have this space baby together. And this was sort of really important kind of mediatic event. So definitely entirely entwined with the logic of how media in a way communicates and develops that subject.
Right. So there's a kind of course, the space program is sort of famously thought of as a TV program, and those who think it never happened believe it's just was a very good program, right? And you speak to another dimension of that this program actually is itself literally a TV program with a kind of domestic narrative. I mean, maybe the Russian vision more progressive in the sense of launching a family into space, right? Versus the American one, where of course it's the male subject who's granted the right to leave, to go outside the house in this case, the planet, right? And the sort of uber domesticity of the American astronaut. So you have a kind of a story, a sort of a TV story in which TV itself is part of the systems, right? The systems of control for launching, for watching, for viewing, for reporting, but also for sharing the kind of glory of your political regime with as many people as possible. So it's kind of an entirely televisual environment. And if you adore TV as I do, you tend to give this televisual environment the status of reality, and everything else has the status of a sort of a fiction. You know, so for example, the American suburban house would be the strangest sort of fictional artifact, somehow wrapping or suspended in these utterly real psychosexual dramas of mythological straight white families, right? But getting back to Russia, because look, let's say getting back to the real world, it's so interesting to me that television, if what the three of us have been saying is true, that television is I think in today's conversation sort of directly identified with capitalism and with commodification and distribution of resources. So when people think of their little cell phone as a kind of pocket TV, they tend to think of it because of this link to kind of commodified desire or desires manufactured by commodity. And so it seems like an important historical lesson to understand the extent to which TV was at the very same time, and equally strongly, if not more strongly, the kind of embodiment of the possibility of a socialist unity, of let's say, of solidarity in the most direct sense.
I mean, I think that's an interesting proposal. I don't know if that's necessarily how it was read in the Eastern Bloc, at least. Maybe I doubt also in the Soviet Union, but it certainly operated as you suggested at first, which was really the way that the kind of soft propaganda was proposed to operate from the US context, that the kind of desire for this item and the various other accoutrements of a kind of lifestyle that it might represent were relevant politically in the context. And so actually, when it comes to Czechs, their presentation, if you of course know the American exposition in Moscow in 1959, the Russians immediately brought the Czech pavilion from Expo 58 to respond to that, as a response to that American presentation, to suggest that actually things are great in the Eastern Bloc as well, right? Like there's a kind of counter narrative that the Czech pavilion could tell with its multimedia presentation, even though those were, you know, based on slides and not on a kind of, you know, multi-screen of films that the Eames has presented.
Right, but it's interesting because, of course, maybe the entire world circles around Czech Republic, right? I mean, because the question would be, when they're making their TVs and all of that, and the architects, I mean, imagining what the TV could be, it's interesting to wonder whether they are leaning further east or further west when they do so.
Well, they're definitely in 58 and in 67, where basically their experiments in multi-screen work that were presented in Expo 58 were explicitly supported and sponsored by the Politburo to be developed further. And so they present work in 67 in that super multimedia visual kind of presentation in that context that makes it into Gene Youngblood's expanded cinema book as one example from the Eastern Bloc, right?
Right. And that makes perfect sense, because there are these twists, because on the one hand, at a certain moment, as you've just said, the Soviet can use the Czech image as a kind of faithful socialist image. But at the same time, for example, when Venturi wants to capture the new kind of media environment, which marks a super American world, he refers to the Czech pavilions precisely, and precisely to those displays which were using slides to simulate. So in other words, once again, the simulation better than the real. But you have the sort of super West, let's say even with Venturi, the West of the West, the sort of market of the market, are pointing to this this image of images produced in Czech Republic, and in not such a different time, the very same, let's say, representations being redeployed on the other side of the Cold War. So as it were, I mean, because I know as much about Czech Republic as could fit on a pen. But one of my fantasies has always been to spend a night in that amazing antenna, which is also a hotel.
I have done that. I have done.
I'm so jealous.
I mean,
see,
so this is where, so
Yeah.
this is a project that in Ještěd Tower, which is a project done in the early 60s. So it wins the competition in 64. And it's certainly the moment when the Czechs are celebrating the kind of space race and all the imagery that's coming actually from the East to them as a kind of topic to celebrate. And it's the moment where the broadcasting sort of companies, or not companies, they are state-sponsored entities, but they are asking for an entire network of teletowers, which start actually in Moscow in 67, I think is the first, or 68 is the first one that is produced. And it certainly combines a kind of space imagery, space desire, space glamour. I mean, the interior of that hotel and transmitter is filled with a kind of James Bond, Cold War kind of fuzzy chairs and, you know, windows that look like they're cut out of a spaceship, right?
Right. And James Bond famously is on one side of the Cold War, right?
Yes.
So again, this kind of confusion. Deane, is there a similar kind of strange crossing over of fantasy and reality in the kind of design world of the space program? I mean, the suits, the capsules, the images, the logos. If I remember rightly, you paid a lot of attention even to the kind of monograms that would be sort of put onto the outfits, like kind of medals or team insignia, or even kind of sort of royal insignia like regalia. Are there kind of crossovers as well, or it's straight left, straight right?
I think for sure the construction of the iconography of these programs, I think on both sides, we're very much sort of producing these as material that would be really communicated through media, and the design in that thinking, the thinking behind the design is very much directed toward that direction. So one sees that play out in the kind of selection of kind of logics of colors, the way that these things are sort of designed to be seen from different perspectives and from different distances away from the camera. Of course, there's all kinds of quite elaborate thinking of this as a kind of stagecraft,
Right.
which I think is, of course, quite clear that the kind of extent of political interest and kind of investment in this sort of race, you know, very much underlines that sort of attention to detail and kind of concerns over how this actually comes across,
Right.
in the sense that it's in such clear competition.
Right. I mean, what I learned from both of you, I think, is that if as Anna said, like TV is the quintessential Cold War medium, it's so interesting how faithfully it honors both sides. Maybe that's exactly what you meant, right? That the perfect Cold War medium would be exactly that medium in which the Cold War could be acted out, right? So it would, yes, by definition, serve both sort of ideological regimes. And perhaps this was already in place in 1927, where both Buckminster Fuller and Leonidov, you know, on the US side and in the super Russian side, could immediately declare that this was not only the appropriate instrument of the sort of respective ideologies, but that it will also be a fundamentally architectural instrument. There would be no architecture without this. And in fact, architecture would, in a certain sense, give way to this. So they have, as you know, in common that both of them basically think that a building should really be an antenna, and that then we should sort of live in that. And once again, perhaps Czechoslovakia got to actually make one, and the others got to dream about it. And both famously, neither Leonidov or Fuller are really fully credited as architects. They are seen to be something else by virtue of having so fundamentally challenged what a building is, which I suppose it brings us to kind of like, well, where are we today in those sorts of arguments? Because if a kind of radical argument about television and the architecture of television calls into question not only what a building is, but also what an architect is. You know, where are we today? Like, are we in and I know you both work on questions of authorship and the figure of the architect, this sort of strange figure of the architect. And I'm wondering, you know, what's your temperature reading on the status of the architect today, relative to this question about whether we are thoroughly televisual now or post-televisual? Like, is there still such a thing as an architect, or still some sort of value in this idea, or is the figure of the architect as sort of stupid and reactionary and uninteresting as the idea of a building with floors, walls, you know, like, is it, or is it that the same thing? What do you think?
Do you want to start, Deane?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, of course, that's where your book, for me, becomes really interesting, Mark, in the sense of the way you frame Waxman's kind of take on the development of this sort of collective notion of an architect, kind of post-individualist, the idea of kind of moving beyond a classical idea of authorship and moving into the architect as a kind of framework of information, where the information becomes a kind of framework to actually rethink the possibility of producing space. And I think in that sense, I'm really interested in how there's a lot of sort of hints or clues in that towards certain developments and kind of critiques, I think, that exist right now around the role of the architect, particularly where we see the sort of mainstream architect increasingly hitched in by kind of a risk adverse framing of kind of post-competition structures, of kind of pre-qualifications, of an entire regime of expanding other kind of consultants sort of staking claims around different aspects of what the architect used to do, which we see playing out, for example, in the kind of emergence of the smart city and the kind of development of the kind of informational city and informational architecture in those terms, of the way that things like big tech are taking that. And of course, we could kind of talk a lot about things like the development of sidewalks, labs, and where that goes in terms of the role of the architect within such a sort of understanding of producing architecture in space.
Is there a role for architects in the smart city? Is it like smart city, dumb architect?
Well, yeah, I think that's a really very important question, because we see the kind of leadership and the kind of downcasting of the kind of position of the architect in the kind of last minute of all of the processes, which are largely defined and decided by information specialists, by tech companies, by a lot of other kind of specialties, where the architect, as you probably followed in that project in Sidewalk Lab with Quayside, the architects were brought in quite late and presented, you know, quite strong sort of visions for a certain very, very well and closely framed, it's a closely framed brief. So the architect in some way is a kind of window dresser on a larger framework, which is a kind of informational system that the architect is not really engaged in. So the notion of Quayside as a kind of information collecting, fully sensing and responsive urban environment, as a kind of post-ideological, you know, space to kind of emancipate the kind of data-savvy citizen, or in this case, kind of account holder. And I think it's really interesting to think about the kind of increasing exclusion of the architect from that kind of discussion within those frameworks.
But are you sad about that, or celebrating that?
I see two sides to it. I think one is that I think there are, of course, really interesting potentials to open up other ways of seeing the potential of space. So I see that as really interesting, but at the same time, we see also how the nightmares of all of this kind of framework, where it goes, where it ends, which, let's say, the kind of extreme optimism and kind of technophilic position of Waxman, we see kind of playing out in a potential nightmare of all of the kind of consolidations and monopolization of control of these environments, private governance, you know, all the kind of layer after layer of what has gone wrong in the way that big tech is played out, and the way that they're proposing to turn that into a kind of three-dimensional experience.
Right. So I'm interested to see if I love, of course, your expression plays out, because that puts us once again in the idea of a kind of, we're in the middle of a TV show that, or, you know, there's a sort of theatrics to this. And I'm kind of curious to get back and find out whether you feel it could have played out differently, or whether this is the sort of uncoiling of certain structures. But for Anna, I know you continue to always think about this sort of self-positioning of the architect, like in relationship to the profession and its history. What's your read on this moment now?
I mean, for me, I mean, this is, again, I'll go a little bit back to your book. I really love this version of Waxman that you produce. I do think, you know, I don't know that I have completely accepted that that is his version of himself, but I like your reading of him as not a person, not someone we're going to assign even pronouns to, but a kind of phenomenon, I guess. And it does make me think of, I mean, for me, he fits perfectly with a series of different characters that you have been working on, all of whom are on the kind of edge of trying to undo or figure out or have an interesting relationship to the field. For me, what I think has probably driven all of my work in one way or another is this question about what is the narrative that an architect tells themselves, or what is the narrative an architect produces about the world in which they're operating? How do they conceptualize it so that their work and their idea about agency in that world make sense and are effective? And so for me, that's a question that has, you know, run both my or motored both my interest in what made or how did the socialist architects understand their role in that context, which I see as radically different than the Western context. And I think their response to it was such that it's not easy to make it fit into our Western art historical conception of what an author is. And so that on one end, and on the other end, I was also interested in something like this together with my co-curators for Office US when we were looking at US architects over 100 years. What is it or how is it that they understood the world in which they operated, and to what extent do they understand that they were in fact producing a national body of work? So, but for me, when I think about this today, I do think that there is something that you offer to us from Watchman, this notion of a kind of distributed and maybe lowercase a architect. That I think is very important in the contemporary moment. And I do think that when I think of that diagram that's behind you, not diagram, the drawing that that Watchman is so obsessed with, I like to imagine it not only as television, but as a diagram of architecture, perhaps a little too even in the different things that are coming together. But if we understand, and I think the contemporary moment understands architecture in that way as a complex interconnection of all kinds of agents, human, non-human, you know, capital, that to begin to work in that world might require a very different conception of authorship. And so I like that model of Watchman that you sort of put forward for us, in which the architect is part of a larger interconnected, less maybe egotistical world than we're used to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, of course, the paradox of Waxman as an individual promoting the idea of no individual. So the sort of architect of the non-architect, and all of those creatures that I'm interested in have that in common, right? But I still think that even within the framework of that argument, the person who voices the argument for, let's say, distributed intelligence could be exemplifying that distributed intelligence in that very moment. If you think of Waxman as a loudspeaker that is kind of, as it were, reporting on signals moving around the web, and to some extent acknowledging what we know to be true of every architectural production, that it's a massively collaborative and complex interactive experience in which the building is more strange than, it's more kind of it has a sort of strange relationship to all of this than anything else. And I was struck by Deane, your expression window dresser, because of course, you know, we've got a couple of options here. One is the architect is sort of gone, or a sort of compromise. I think that, as Anna was explaining, is sort of the architect is sort of a willing participant, a team player, to use Waxman's kind of vocabulary. But then there's the idea of the window dresser, and I was thinking that, of course, we shouldn't knock window dressing. I was thinking Kiesler did some of his most important projects in these shop windows in Manhattan. And in fact, as you probably know, he had this idea that the ultimate window display would be a TV. And in fact, a museum would be better off as a TV, and it might as well be in a street window because more people would sort of see it. So I think these two options are extremely interesting, both of them. One the kind of multinodal sort of Bruno Latour kind of everybody's an actor, including the technologies and the equipment and the conversations and the rooms and everything. And this other one of a kind of really a profession, the window dresser, which somehow sits between some inside and some outside, is working on kind of interface design, right? Like making a kind of window. And I think if we were to turn around to all the architects of the world and say, oh, we have it figured out. Lucky for you, in this conversation between the three of us, we sorted out your entire future, and all of you are just going to be window dressers. I feel like actually some astonishing architectural production would result, right? Like, in other words, the whatever is the intelligence of the architect would produce some kind of visualization, some window dressing, yes. So in a way useless, but on the other hand, maybe an important art. And I want to frame it to you, Deane, as a question, because I know that some of your most sort of sustained research has also involved situations in which there don't seem to be any architects at all. I was thinking of your work on sort of recreational vehicle communities of seniors, where you demonstrate that it's an astonishing architecture, and an architecture precisely produced by and for and through a group, the so-called aged, that is precisely not part of the architectural image. We never, so you sort of focused on what architects never focus on. And it seems to have an architecture as radical as any of the radical architecture of the 60s, or it seems to be the 60s continued. Can you kind of share a little bit about whether all of that world is great because there's no architects involved, or this is exactly collaborative architecture in action? Like, what's going on with these astonishing communities that you're studying?
Yeah, I mean, that's why, I also was, when I was reading your book, I was very much, there's a lot of things that resonate around this notion of a kind of distributed informational urbanism, which in the case of the senior RV community that I was looking at in the US, is really a sort of, as you say, kind of very distributed set of kind of particles that are consisting of vehicles, that are in many ways as socially coherent as a result of this shift from kind of military technology of satellite internet as it becomes kind of commercially available, that becomes a kind of platform for social cohesion across this community, and the role, particularly in the early 2000s, as that technology became available, the idea of these websites, which had huge memberships of up to 1 million, largely seniors, who would organize and coordinate to meet up. They would swap recipes. There would be all kinds of, let's say, a kind of social platform that produces very coherent architecture, if you could say, or even urbanism that is as sort of socially coherent as it is sort of spatially distributed. And in this way, to think about the role of infrastructure and the notion of the satellite as the kind of glue of this community produces these sort of fascinating moments where the sort of non-physical meets the physical, where you see these RVs landing, as you've probably all seen in Walmart parking lots, landing in the kind of Arizona desert, and producing sort of instant cities that, as you say, also echo some of the really radical experiments of the 60s and 70s, and in particular the work, for example, of Instant City by Archigram, the work by David Green, where things like the log plug or the rock plug represent this kind of infrastructure, this kind of disappearing invisible infrastructure that this kind of architecture is plugging into. So I think that this idea for me was absolutely fascinating, both that there were not really architects involved in this sort of urbanity, but also the notion that this radical experiment is kind of realized by the same kind of cohort in their later years as the cohort that produced the radical experiments of the 60s.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, because I was going to say that It did, the funny thing is in the sort of, I mean, I think David Green's a total genius, and a sort of a thought, thinker. And somehow the fact that that he is such a thinker gets lost a little bit in the kind of happy vision of Archigram. But the happy vision, there are no old people. I was the other day accusing them, of imagining a world in which they themselves now, as grumpy old men, would have no place. But the one exception is precisely David Green, where he shows somebody almost retired fishing in a garden with a little portable TV set which maintains his domesticity. So it seems to me it makes perfect sense what you're saying, that there is this extraordinarily complex, technologically advanced community which is occupying all the sort of spaces and modalities that architects don't consider anymore. But it hadn't occurred to me the thing you just said, that of course the inhabitants of those vehicles are precisely the generation of the 60s that were so young and so happy and so free. And now they are not so young, but they seem even happier and even freer. And perhaps maybe you are the one that's going to ruin it, because finally with your work, the figure of the architect and architectural theory arrives. Like maybe 10 years from now, they'll send signals to each other and say, it was all great until that, what is his name? Deane something came in and revealed us to be sort of, but it is a kind of countercultural, as you say, televisual urbanism, not accounted for by our discipline, but perhaps not accounted for by our politics either, our understanding of what constitutes the sort of political possibilities. I was going to ask it as a very crude question, Anna, like if all architects were to receive a signal now, I guess a text message or whatever, insisting that that they all become socialist architects, what do you think might happen?
I'm not
like,
sure.
would anything change? Like, would a lot of them say, even those who make enormously expensive museums for corporations, say, "Oh, I am one already"? I mean,
I think this may be a generational question. I know, like there's traps in thinking this way, but I do think that the generation of students in architecture right now, at least in the US schools, is willingly and happily headed in a different direction, and in fact looking for models of dreaming differently about how to intervene and have agency in the world as architects, right? So I do think we will see something soon that will be different, but whether or not
they would use the word socialist to self-describe their positioning.
No, I can't. I'm gonna put words in their mouth, maybe. But
but okay. So let me make the mistake, because I think, for example, with Bernie Sanders and so on, exactly what you described, it was palpable in schools of architecture that students read the language and even the status of a word like socialist. They read it differently, and they connected, and not by chance, perhaps. Bernie Sanders old enough to be in one of those recreational vehicles. There's a resonance between the political, the sense of political purpose that our students feel deeply, and an earlier moment in history where there was a potential for architects to, just in I suppose a first post-Cold War sort of flush, like a kind of moment just after, sometimes referred to as a radical moment, right? There seems to be this bond, and I'm wondering if, but perhaps you're right. Perhaps this generation, really doesn't care about the label, or even thinks it's a label.
The label is obviously extremely problematic, especially in the U.S. context, and it has been vilified in large part by the medium or through the medium of television,
right?
Including that McCarthy moment when Watchman loses his hanger, I guess. Though maybe it's okay that he did, but I do think, and I don't know, when you say, there was another moment, maybe there was another moment, maybe there was another moment elsewhere, and maybe that moment never existed, but we can access it as a kind of avatar of possibilities that will become future possibilities. right?
Right,
So I do
right.
think it's important to look at the dreams that were dreamt on the other side, because they were circumscribed differently um, than the Western ones. But that doesn't mean that it was great in that context. So it's very important um, not to immediately assume that version of socialism we had in the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union is the one to strive for. Like, that is not
Yeah.
what I think the young students of architecture are wishing for. They're wanting something else, but there are certain elements in that mode of operating for architects that I think is relevant for today, is an
Yeah.
important model to understand.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking that this word, like the word television, is a kind of strange attractor. I mean, it works in strange ways, right? But one part of that word, it seems to me, is some gesture towards solidarity, and concepts of solidarity have changed so radically since earlier in the century. So now that same word could evoke a more complicated idea of how do you establish solidarity within difference. Like, there's this incredible sensitivity to structural inequities, particularly turning around binaries, which segment society and stratify. So kind of outings and downings of different kinds. And so there is a kind of a sort of a search for a way in which one could still think of solidarity, of mutual support, and a kind of even a kind of a domesticity of togetherness, where togetherness means being together with the other, and a non-patronized, non-excluded, non-demoted other. And this political project, it is a really big question, right? Whether it can draw on these earlier thoughts, or should just use them as guideposts of where not to go. And it certainly, I think in Waxman's case is a kind of a dream of a connectivity, but there's no language of difference. It seems implied in the Waxman imagination is a kind of sort of family of man, universal collectivity in which there are no individuals, which starts to get very close to solidarity in its most classical sense. And I guess this is maybe the final thing we could explore together. What I observe in these figures, these sort of counter-architectural figures or anti-architectural figures, is actually the counterpart is so close to the affirmative part, in the same way that technologies of radical democracy seem to be also, with almost no difference, technologies of extreme surveillance and control. So actually the line between anti-architect and architect would be very fragile and sort of flicker. And again, I just coming back to you, I know that, for example, Deane, you think about this question of segmentation and even the kind of capitalist project as a kind of organization of segmentation, a kind of breaking into groups and so on. Is your work also kind of curious of an undoing of this sort of segmentation?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that just picking up a little bit on this question of the shifting way of framing how the culture has changed, and let's say the current sort of crop of students. I think also, Anna, you're pointing to it as well, that there is a kind of shift toward the idea of how, let's say, what the project is of the architect, what the matters of concern really are. And I think also in terms of agency, how those students are planning to go about doing that. And I think in that sense, there is kind of, in my sense anyway, a kind of emerging diversification and a kind of explosion of different possible biographies that seem to sort of open up to this current group, where there are sort of recent graduates and current students are kind of pointing toward many different tracks, from politics to different forms of other kinds of activism, to really working towards kind of prodding different forms of corporate entities. I think there's really, to me, seems to be another culture of challenging the sort of early century millennial individual architect. And I think that this discussion about how we look at segmentation that you're pointing to, Mark, in the work that I was doing also around aging, for me is really problematic where that's going. And problematic in the sense that some of these studies, and another study that I looked at was an environment which is a retirement community in Florida called The Villages, the world's largest retirement community, which basically is producing a massive sort of homogeneous group of around 130,000 seniors that effectively represent one or two segments of this kind of 66 classic segments of this kind of PRISM market segmentation instrument. So one sees the idea that the way that the market in this sense is producing not housing but lifestyle products that are directed toward 1/66th of the kind of consumer segment, that's producing this sort of kind of anti-urbanism in the sense of spaces of diversity, tolerance, and so on. And in a way, what interests me is that it becomes a kind of spatial, physical kind of spatial representation of this kind of societal fragmentation that we see in the social media discussion that's been going on in recent years, where literally we see a kind of entire city almost built around one market segment, which is connected intimately with a kind of media strategy. So the idea is that the media, the local media of this environment is communicating to one kind of consumer in a highly precise, almost without any kind of signal noise, to one kind of consumer, which becomes a kind of business model for a very, very effective form of capitalist urbanism. And that sort of has all kinds of ramifications over political expression, that the political voice is controlled by the owner of those media. And that has a kind of huge impact on where resources go. There are many kind of issues around, let's say, the way that the market is increasingly producing housing and other forms of spatial products, really according to segmented logics. And we see that reinforcing, let's say, the kind of logic of community at the cost of society.
Right.
So I think that that's sort of the direction that things have been going. And I think that there's increasingly an awareness of that we need to actually counter these movements.
Right.
You're making me think of a piece of that, a quote out of your Watchman book, Mark, that is about taking core samples out of a suburban house and a modernist house, and basically suggesting, you remember that paragraph where he talks about just the kind of visual of the notion that one might take a core sample out of lifestyle and architecture, a kind of a sectional piece, and compare them and sort of propose how those, in his case, he's saying architecture isn't modern when you do that. Even modern architecture isn't modern. And Deane, what you are describing just in Watchman core sample terms is a kind of uniformity and sameness in different sectors of the market. But that doesn't speak about or to the wish for connectedness and collectivity that Mark reads, at least in Watchman.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a great and pessimistic way for us to end, because here television seems to be the name of segmentation, like the construction of an interior through, as you said, Deane, as signals with no noise. Everything is perfectly tuned to the audience. It seems to echo a little bit in my mind conversations about the bubble, about sort of bubble logics. What I found so interesting about what you're saying is also that it's a specific community in Florida. So in this case, the bubble is actually in space, like in a particular part of space, whereas the normal discussion recently about bubbles has, I think, to do with the strange sense in which we could all be dispersed and yet inside very exclusive zero noise and zero tolerance, because maybe noise and tolerance are related, zero tolerance bubbles. So the implication of what you're both saying is that every now and then this sort of despatialized sense of solidarity with specific groups that occupy the same bubble can also have highly spatialized consequences, you know, in the more classic understanding of the city. Does that sound right?
I mean, you're making me think now of that more authoritarian TV in the Eastern Bloc, where a single or two stations were available. and everyone was tuned into them simultaneously. And the fact that though that was a great vehicle that brought propaganda into the private domestic space in some sense, it also didn't guarantee that the populations watching would buy it. And in fact, it allowed a kind of a collective disregard for the message, if in some instances at least, in the way that the current moment where you can tune into whatever you want to, that's perfectly synchronized with your life and worldviews, you may never access the kind of simultaneous collective that those early authoritarian TVs allowed for.
Okay, so this is the perfect ending. The word disregard, like to not look. The difficulty today, the almost impossibility of not looking, and all looking being somewhat into a mirror in which you reconstruct yourself according to the logic of the others who you believe to be looking into the same mirror. This is the nightmare. It could well be the nightmare of television, right? It could be exactly what it means to be in TV, like inside TV. But I think that the potential, Anna, that you point to, even the political obligation to disregard, to develop a kind of a gaze away. This could be, let's say, our project or our urgent project. How to think that through. For me personally, listening to both of you and reading your work and following your work and your exhibitions and books, it's all endlessly amazing, and it seems to me endlessly urgent to pay attention to what you're saying in order to try to manufacture a kind of disregard. If architecture has always been thought of as something made to be looked at, might be interesting to think of a project for sort of unhinging the gaze. But so much fun. I'm sorry to end the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Both of you.
Pleasure for me too.